"You're faking it, kid. If you can wheel yourself down, then you don't need a ramp." That was Velma Corbin, president of the Cypress Thorn Bluffs HOA, as she wrapped her bony fingers around the handles of my son's wheelchair and yanked. Rowan screamed, a real tearing scream, and his palms flew to the wheels to try and stop her. But she was already dragging him down the porch landing, bump by bump, toward the sidewalk. One wheel caught on the bottom step. He lurched. She didn't care. She kept pulling, and my cruiser dash cam was recording every damn second. I was out of the driver's seat before my boots even hit the pavement. 3 seconds flat from engine off to sprint. My hand went to my badge out of habit, but my eyes stayed locked on Rowan, 8 years old, paraplegic, and just brave enough to try rolling himself down that ramp today. "Velma!" I shouted. "Step away from my son!" She turned just as her grip slipped off the wheelchair. His footplate scraped the concrete. My chest hit her shoulder before I could stop myself. "Now, before we go any further, you should know something. That ramp, it's not just ADA compliant, it's city permitted, fire code exempt, and legally protected under Georgia Civil Ordinance 15.6a. And I'm the sheriff who signed the first ADA review training order in this county, the one Velma Corbin ignored. So if you're watching this because someone sent you the footage, yeah, that's me in the video. That's Rowan screaming. That's Velma violating federal law on camera. And this is only the start. Subscribe right now if you believe people like her shouldn't be allowed to run communities unchecked. Because what happens next? It's what took her down. My name is Merrick Langston. I've worn this badge for 20 years. I've testified in federal court, cleared murder scenes with nothing but a flashlight, and held sobbing strangers during tornado evacuations. But I've never once needed to invoke that resume. Not until the day Velma decided to lay her hands on my son. Rowan can't feel anything below the waist. He hasn't since the day a school bus tipped sideways on a slick hill and pinned him underneath. He was 6. His mother, Lana, painted that ramp with him the day before she started chemo. He held the brush. She held his hand. They painted stars all the way down to the curb. 2 years later, she passed away. That ramp stayed. I reinforced it myself. I submitted the city permits. I mailed copies to the HOA, certified, signed. I thought that was enough. I thought people like Velma would see a disabled child and feel something human. Instead, she called it a blemish on the neighborhood's colonial aesthetic. She wanted it gone by winter. I didn't budge. So she showed up on my porch with a citation in one hand and pure arrogance in the other. She stood on the bricks Lana laid and said I was violating unity codes, that my special treatment was creating divisive appearances. She said all that, then dragged my son off the ramp. When I pulled Rowan back to me, his eyes were full of something I hadn't seen since the ICU. Confusion, fear, and disbelief that someone would hurt him for existing. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't have to threaten a lawsuit. All I did was point at my cruiser. "Velma," I said, "that's a department-issued recording device. Audio, visual, time-stamped." She paled, but only for a second. Then she sneered, straightened her HOA name badge, and said, "You won't ruin me with a tantrum. My board backs me." Maybe they did, but the ADA doesn't, and neither does state law. I took Rowan inside, sat with him until the trembling stopped. Then I pulled the footage, tagged the time code, and opened a new case file. CPS, ADA Compliance Unit, County Review Board. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was evidence. Where are you watching from? The next morning, the violation notice was already nailed to the ramp. Red letters. HOA letterhead. Unauthorized modification. Non-conforming external structure. Signed by Velma Corbin, of course. Dated 15 minutes after she tried to drag my son into the street. I stood on the porch and stared at it. The screws were still warm from the drill she, or one of her volunteers, had used. The paper was laminated like they expected rain. Or maybe they just wanted to make sure it couldn't be torn down without effort. Rowan didn't want to come outside that morning. He'd gone quiet, like he used to after physical therapy, when the pain made him retreat into himself. I didn't push. Instead, I wheeled his chair up beside the window and let him sit in the sunlight with a blanket around his legs and his stuffed space raccoon on his lap. He didn't look at the ramp, but I did. I noticed something I hadn't before. Just beneath the ramp's final support beam, a small plastic survey flag had been stabbed into the grass, yellow and white, It wasn't city-issued, it was private utility grade, marked Notice Remove. That meant they were planning more than citations. Velma wasn't just targeting the ramp. She was preparing for removal. I walked the perimeter of our yard, 2 more flags near the side gate, a paint marker by the curb. They were framing the entire access path like it was something to be erased. Not because it violated code, not because it endangered anyone, but because it offended her idea of what a house should look like. I opened my HOA file drawer in the kitchen. Every citation we'd received since moving in, every photo, every envelope. The first notice was from a month after Rowan came home from rehab. Excessive medical equipment visible from street view. That was the ramp lift. The second came 3 weeks later. Noise disturbance, repetitive metal clanging. That was Rowan's wheelchair hitting the porch railing while he learned to turn. Then came warnings. For a delivery ramp left on the lawn during installation. For lack of architectural cohesion. For a temporary awning during storms. I'd appealed each one. Each time, I was denied. The worst part wasn't just the letters. It was how no one else seemed to get them. Not the neighbors who kept basketball hoops in the driveway or holiday wreaths up until February. Not the one with the big wooden swing set that violated fence height limits. Just us. And it wasn't just Velma behind it. The board signed off on these. They stamped the fines. Someone was keeping a record of every moment my son existed visibly in this neighborhood and labeling it non-compliant. I remembered one meeting, months back, where I raised the issue of ADA accommodations and got blank stares. Velma had said, "Of course we respect federal law, but that doesn't mean we ignore aesthetic impact." That was her loophole. That was how she framed it. Not discrimination, just design. But it was targeted, systematic, and, I was starting to suspect, coordinated. I drove down the street later that day and passed the Herrick's house. Their daughter had leg braces from a spinal condition. They used a rolling walker and a reinforced handrail at their front steps. I pulled over. There was a fine taped to their mailbox. Unauthorized modification. It hit me then. Velma wasn't just targeting my family. She was purging visibility. I snapped a photo of the notice and tucked it away. This wasn't going to be a single complaint anymore. This was a pattern, a hostile environment built on paperwork and paint flags, designed to push people like Rowan out without saying it out loud. At the next house, I saw something even stranger, an HOA volunteer clipboard in hand, taking pictures of someone's lawn, and standing behind him, silent, arms folded, was Edric Whalen, the treasurer. He didn't move when I slowed my cruiser, didn't wave, but he looked straight at me, and something passed between us, silent, hesitant, but there. He wasn't comfortable, and he wasn't on board with all of this. He just hadn't said anything. Not yet. I drove home slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to look at every yard, every porch, every sign of quiet pressure. There were dozens of little signs, paint marks, tags, clipboard photos, inspection slips. They weren't managing a neighborhood. They were scrubbing it. And now they'd left screws in my ramp and terror in my son's voice. But they didn't know what I knew. And they didn't know what I'd already begun building. I saw Edric Whalen again 2 days later. He was standing alone beneath the shade of the clubhouse oak, clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield. The same clipboard the HOA officers used when issuing citations, except that his wasn't filled with paper. It looked empty, clean, untouched. It was the monthly compliance walk. Velma had insisted on doing them in person now, claiming it improved. Transparency. What it really did was give her the stage. She walked 10 feet ahead of the others, sunglasses on, lips pursed like she was inspecting troops, not porches. She never looked at me directly, just the ramp. They crossed my driveway without pause. Velma didn't stop. Didn't glance at Rowan, who was once again tucked inside behind the front window. She just held up her phone, snapped another photo of the ramp, and muttered something to the clipboard carrier behind her. That was Edric. But he didn't write anything down. He just watched her. Then he looked up at the second-floor window. I was standing there, arms crossed. His eyes met mine, and they didn't move away. I didn't nod. Neither did he. But the moment lasted longer than it should have. That afternoon, a second citation appeared on our mailbox. This one wasn't laminated. It was folded in half, creased twice. The language was sterile. Unresolved violation escalation. Code 6.4b, repeat non-compliance. A $500 fine, threat of lien. Standard language, I'd read it before. Except this one wasn't signed. No name, no initials, no timestamp. That wasn't just sloppy. That was intentional. They were beginning to slip. Or someone on the inside was slipping on purpose. Later that evening, I walked over to the clubhouse myself. I wanted to see who stayed behind after Velma's rounds. The board used to post minutes on the front windows. Now they only updated a password-locked website that required a login I'd been waiting for approval on since January. The lights were still on inside. Through the tinted glass, I could make out two silhouettes. Velma, straight back, animated hands, and Edric, seated, shoulders slumped, not looking at her. I stayed across the street, half behind the corner of the maintenance shed. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. Edric's body language said enough. He wasn't pushing back, but he wasn't participating either. He was stuck. And I knew that feeling. You don't work 2 decades in law enforcement without recognizing a man who's watching something wrong unfold and thinking it's too late to stop it. He wasn't cruel like Velma. He wasn't eager. He wasn't holding that clipboard like a weapon. He was holding it like a lifeline. Like if he just kept doing the minimum, he wouldn't drown in the guilt. But guilt has a way of creeping in through the quiet. The next morning, I saw him again, this time in front of his own house. He was kneeling in the grass, adjusting one of the sprinkler heads. Nothing unusual, except his knees were wrapped in braces, industrial grade, the kind people wear after reconstructive surgery, and he moved like someone who'd done more than one tour through recovery. I'd never noticed before. His porch had no steps, just a short graded walkway with a handrail, decorative but functional. He understood what it meant to fight for every inch of mobility. Even if he hadn't said it out loud, I waited until he stood up. "Afternoon," I said. He looked over, startled, but didn't bolt. "Afternoon, Sheriff." We stood there in silence for a beat. "You're not the only one they've come for," I said finally. His jaw tensed. He didn't answer. Then he said, "Some things can't be fought head-on." I nodded slowly. Some things shouldn't be walked away from either. Another silence. He looked toward my house, toward the ramp. "I didn't vote for the removal," he said. "For the record." "I know." He hesitated, then added, "It was unanimous on paper, but not all votes are honest." I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't have to. He was halfway there already, still scared, still cautious. But the crack was forming. I could feel it. Velma had the power, but Edric had the keys. All he needed was one good reason to hand them over. The official removal notice came on a Friday. Bright green envelope, certified mail. Delivered by a courier instead of the post office. Like they wanted the weight of it to land directly in my hand. I didn't open it right away. I knew what was inside. I waited until Rowan was asleep before slicing it open at the kitchen table. Inside, a formal declaration from the Cypress Thorn Bluffs HOA, citing Section 3.9 of the Aesthetic Cohesion Clause and informing me that non-conforming fixtures, specifically the painted accessibility ramp and attached mechanical lift, must be removed within 14 days. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal action, including potential placement of a lien on my property and escalation to municipal enforcement channels. It was a threat. No mention of ADA exemptions, no acknowledgement of prior correspondence, no reference to the city permits I'd sent, signed, and resent, just a cold, rigid demand to erase my son's independence. The language was deliberate, carefully sanitized to sound lawful, but I'd written citations in my life. I knew the tone when someone was weaponizing policy to bully. This wasn't about community standards, this was targeted hostility. The next morning, I took a walk around the block with Rowan. He wanted to go, said he missed the sun on his face, that it didn't hurt as much if we went early. I wheeled him past the cul-de-sac where the Herricks lived. Their ramp was gone. I stopped cold. Where once there had been a narrow concrete slope leading to a side door, now there was only grass, freshly laid. No visible remnants of the handrail, the non-slip strip, the platform. Rowan followed my gaze. "What happened?" he asked. I knelt beside his chair. "They took it down," I said quietly. "Did they want to?" I looked at him. 8 years old, too smart for his own peace. "No," I said. "I don't think they did." He nodded, as if that explained everything. "Back home, I found another violation posted to the HOA's internal website. The same portal supposedly still didn't have login credentials for. One of my deputies, Tyler, lived in the neighborhood next door. I asked him to check it for me. He called 10 minutes later. They added a clause, he said. Special amendment to the architectural guidelines. No unpainted exterior fixtures, no visible mechanicals, no murals or decorative paint on structural elements. I leaned back in my chair. They wrote it after the ramp was already built? I asked. Timestamp says last week, he confirmed. They're backdating it in the letters. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was sabotage, coordinated, with paperwork to back it up. I hung up and looked at the ramp. The stars were fading from sun exposure. Lana's brushstrokes were still visible if you looked close enough. The soft blues, the whites, the tiny gold specks meant to look like distant galaxies. She'd painted them so Rowan could dream about space, even when his legs couldn't take him there. I sat down and made a list. Every family I'd seen with medical accommodations. Every ramp, rail, lift, and access slope I could remember. Then I cross-referenced it with violation notices I'd photographed over the past 6 months. The pattern was undeniable. Out of 16 citations for structural noncompliance in the past half year, 13 were issued to homes with visible medical access features. 13. That wasn't aesthetics, that was targeting. I put in a call to City Access Services, asked for a compliance inspector by name, Carmen Kell. We'd worked a missing persons case together a few years back. She owed me a favor. I didn't say much over the phone, just asked her to come take a look, quietly, no formal report, not yet. She agreed, said she'd bring her tablet and walk the block like she was surveying curb slope data. I didn't tell her about the dashcam footage yet. I didn't need to, not yet. Because before I turned this into a formal complaint, I needed one more piece, confirmation. A sign from someone inside that they knew what was happening, that they'd seen it, and that maybe, just maybe, they were ready to stop it. Edric hadn't spoken since that day in his yard, but I'd seen him watching. At some point, a man has to pick a side. I just had to make sure I was ready when he did. Carmen showed up 2 days later, dressed in plain clothes and carrying a digital tablet she kept half tucked beneath a leather folio. She parked 2 streets down, walked the rest of the way in slow, deliberate passes, pausing every so often to make what looked like generic slope measurements or curb access notes. To anyone else, she looked like another city planner, maybe assessing drainage angles or pedestrian access. Nothing that would raise flags with Velma or her clipboard patrol. But I knew better. We met near the community bulletin board by the tennis courts, just out of view of the main clubhouse. Carmen didn't waste time on pleasantries. You weren't kidding, she said, flipping her folio open. I've already logged 6 violations that don't line up with current code, meaning they shouldn't exist at all, and 4 of them specifically target ADA-compliant modifications. Backdated? I asked. Worse, they're citing non-existent sections or inventing terminology like visual conflict zones. That's not a thing. She turned her screen toward me. A photo of a citation taped to a ramp at lot 27. Same format as mine, same red lettering, same signature. Velma again, I muttered. She's using architectural cohesion as a blanket weapon, but none of the cited properties had alterations that require HOA override. The city's exemption process covers all of them. Carmen tapped her pen against the tablet. And there's something else? Several homes listed for resale in the past year show photos of ramps and rails that aren't there anymore, which means either the sellers removed them to avoid citations, or they were forced to by the board. I didn't speak for a moment. This was bigger than harassment. It was removal by design. Erasure, slowly executed with paperwork and fees until the families gave up or moved out. I need it official, I said. Carmen nodded. I'll compile the violations, cross-reference with ADA law, and send a preliminary flag to the Office of Housing Compliance. They'll investigate quietly at first, but once that video of Velma dragging your son goes in, it won't stay quiet long. I exhaled, part relief, part fire. Let me know when you submit it. I will. We parted ways. She disappeared down a walking path, already making new notes, already drawing invisible lines between what this HOA said it cared about and what it actually enforced. Back home, I passed the ramp slowly. Rowan was inside, reading. The stars Lana painted were starting to peel at the corners, the gold flecks almost faded. I hadn't repainted it, not since she died. I couldn't bring myself to touch what she'd made for him. That night, I watched the dash cam footage again. I'd stored it in 3 places: external drive, cloud backup, and private sheriff's archive. I ran the timestamp forward, listened to the audio, heard Rowan scream, heard Velma's exact words. "You're faking it, kid?" That line stayed with me, not just because of the cruelty, but because of what it revealed: intent, deliberate dismissal of his disability, not a misunderstanding, not a dispute, contempt. And contempt mattered in cases like this. I knew the ADA clause she violated. Section 1282B2A Distash of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Unlawful to deny full and equal enjoyment of services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations on the basis of disability, especially when done by someone in a position of governance or authority. The ramp removal wasn't just a code violation now. It was federal territory. But even with Carmen's data, the footage, and my records, I needed something else. Proof that the board knew what they were doing was illegal and chose to do it anyway. That's what would elevate this from a violation to a systemic abuse case. The next morning, I saw Edric again. He was out early trimming the hedge near his porch. Same tired slouch, same quiet motions. But this time, when I passed, he looked up first. He gave me a slight nod. I stopped walking. "You have a minute?" I asked. He hesitated, then gestured toward the porch. Inside, his living room was tidy, sparse. The walls were covered in framed architectural sketches, bridges, libraries, ramps. I noticed a photo of him standing beside a completed war memorial. There was a quote on the base: "Accessibility is dignity made visible." He followed my eyes. "My thesis project," he said, 40 years ago. He sat. The silence stretched. Then, finally, he spoke. "There's something you should see." He didn't get up right away. Edric sat still on the edge of his chair, hands laced loosely, as if deciding whether to stand or to vanish. His lips pressed into a thin line, like he was holding something in, not out of fear, but calculation. Then he reached behind the cushion, pulled out a slim black folder, and set it on the coffee table between us. "I didn't print everything," he said, "but these were the ones I couldn't look away from." I opened the folder. Inside were 7 sheets. Each one was a printed email chain, all originating from Velma Corbin's HOA address. I read in silence. The first thread began simple enough: a board update about exterior design deviations. But then the tone shifted. Velma's language sharpened. "Certain features create visual chaos. Our neighborhood should not feel like a rehabilitation center. There is a standard to uphold." The second chain was worse. "It's not personal, but once you allow one painted ramp, you open the floodgates. That sheriff thinks his badge gives him license to clutter the block with pity." The third: "We need to quietly enforce pressure, strategic citations, deny appeals on grounds of procedural failure, then require repeat filing. They'll either fall in line or get exhausted trying." And at the bottom of that one, Edric's name. His response was a single sentence: "This seems discriminatory." No reply followed. I looked up. "You tried," I said. He didn't answer right away, just reached for a glass of water and took a sip like it hurt his throat. "I drafted a formal objection," he said finally. "It never made it past the chair. Velma said it was a board unity risk. I was told to stay silent or recuse myself." "Why didn't you?" I asked. He stared at the ramp outside his window, the edge of it just visible through the trees between our yards. "Because if I left," he said, "no one would be there to watch, and I thought maybe that was still something." I nodded once, slowly. "These were sent before she dragged Rowan," I said. "Yes." "So she already planned to escalate?" "Yes." "And she knew about the ADA exemptions." "She read them out loud in the meeting, called them technical shields." I closed the folder. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. This changed everything. The footage showed the act. Carmen's survey proved the pattern. But these emails, they showed intent, premeditated strategy, targeting. They turned Velma's campaign from negligence into a case of deliberate discrimination. You ready to step forward? I asked. Edric looked at the floor. Not yet, he said. Not officially. Not until I know there's no way for her to wriggle out. I didn't press him, not yet. Instead, I asked, "Can I copy these?" He nodded. "I have the originals." Back home, I scanned every page, tagged them with dates, synced the timestamps with the dashcam footage and Carmen's report. Then I opened a new file on the sheriff's internal server. Case designation, HOA Discriminatory Enforcement, Cypress Thorn Bluffs. Complainant, Sheriff Merrick Langston. Subject, HOA Board, President Velma Corbin. Supporting documentation, 1. Incident footage, 2. Email records, 3. ADA exemption permits, 4. Witness statements pending. It wasn't submitted yet, but it was ready. That night, Rowan asked me if we could repaint the ramp. "Why now?" I asked him, brushing his hair back as he got ready for bed. "Because it's ours," he said, "and I want it to look like it used to, like Mom made it." I didn't answer right away. My throat was tight. "We will," I promised. "Just give me a little more time." He nodded, already drifting towards sleep. Outside, I stepped onto the porch, sat beside the ramp. I touched the peeling edge of a star and let my fingers rest there. The wood was weathered, but it held, just like we would. Velma had written her plan in emails. Now I would write the end of it, in filings, in footage, and in federal law. She wouldn't see it coming. The package arrived in a plain manila envelope slipped through my mail slot without a return address. No postmark, no stamps, hand-delivered. I found it early, just past 6. The house was quiet. Rowan was still asleep. I slid the envelope open cautiously, half expecting another fine or threat from Velma's latest HOA stunt. But it wasn't that. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no label, just cold plastic and silence. I didn't hesitate. I booted my offline work laptop, standard sheriff's procedure for unverified digital media. Plugged in the drive, waited, 4 files loaded. Each one was a voice recording, all time-stamped, all tagged with board meeting dates I recognized, dates from my own violation appeal timeline, meetings I'd never been allowed to attend, meetings the HOA had claimed were administrative only. I played the first one. It was Velma. Will always see the sheriff thinks we're scared of his badge. But policy is policy, and emotional manipulation isn't a defense against community standards. The ramp has to go. Another voice chimed in, male, nervous. I still think we should double-check with legal. He's shown us the permits. Velma again, sharper. The city's rubber-stamped worse. That ramp is a permanent structure that visually disrupts the block. We're allowed to act. The second file was worse. I don't care if it's ADA compliant. It's disruptive. We'll cite him under aesthetic nonconformity and force an appeal. Every time, he'll either lose patience or pay his way out. I paused the playback, my jaw locked. This wasn't just bigotry. This was premeditated, coordinated obstruction, a strategy. She'd weaponized HOA language to push Rowan's ramp into non-existence. I opened the third file, silence for several seconds. Then Edric's voice, quieter. "We're writing rules to hurt a child." Velma's response was ice. "We're preserving standards. If people can't live up to them, they don't belong here." That was the moment, right there. The moment it all changed. I closed the lid, pulled the drive, locked it in my evidence drawer, then I texted Edric. "Got the files. I'll handle it from here. You did the right thing." The dots blinked for a while before he answered. "I know. It still doesn't feel like enough." "It will." That afternoon, I called Carmen. I didn't send the files yet. There was protocol for handling audio evidence, but I told her I had voice recordings verifying that Velma and the board had knowingly targeted ADA-protected structures and coordinated a denial strategy. She didn't ask how I got them. She just asked one question. "Are you ready to go formal?" I looked at the ramp. Rowan was out there with sidewalk chalk, drawing galaxies with one arm while steadying himself on the chair with the other. "Yes." "Then I'm calling a full compliance audit," she said. "I'll notify Office of Fair Housing. The ADA team will get a packet next week. When the press asks for a quote, I'll give them one." She hung up. No drama, no speeches, just action. I printed transcripts of the audio files, cross-referenced them with the email threads Edric had given me. I clipped everything into a clean report binder. On the cover, I attached a note. This package contains evidence of coordinated and malicious interference with federally protected accessibility accommodations. Then I added one last thing to the internal case file. A name, Waylon Edric, witness, HOA board member. He'd crossed the line now, quietly, carefully, but fully. He hadn't just watched anymore, he'd chosen. The next morning, a new sign was posted at the entrance of Cypress Thorn Bluffs. White vinyl, plastic lettering. HOA Emergency Board Meeting, members only, Tuesday, August 7 p.m. I knew what that meant. Velma had felt it shift. Maybe. She didn't know the full weight of what was coming, but she knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the silence, in the way her once loyal board members had started whispering, hesitating, avoiding her eyes. Power slips fastest when you think it's permanent. I stood at the edge of my porch as the wind picked up, tugging at the last few gold-flecked stars on the ramp. Rowan waved from the driveway, and I waved back, knowing this fight wasn't theory anymore. It was active, it was documented, and it was already in motion. The day of the emergency board meeting, I didn't suit up. I wore jeans, a dark shirt, and the same boots I'd built the ramp in. No badge, no gun, just presence. That was all I needed now. Rowan watched me from the window as I stepped outside. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't need to. The meeting notice had been taped to our door, too. Another copy, crooked, as if whoever posted it didn't have the nerve to press it flat. The corners fluttered in the breeze. I had the binder in my hand. Not the original, that stayed locked at the station. This was a printed replica, marked courtesy copy, across the cover. Inside, Carmen's violation assessment, time-stamped dashcam footage stills, Edric's printed email chains, and typed transcripts of Velma's voice on the recordings. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, precise, clean. I parked across the street from the clubhouse. The HOA board had already gathered, 7 chairs arranged in a half circle, Velma in the center like a judge without a robe. Her hair was pulled tight, her expression tighter. 2 assistants flanked her, each with tablets open and styluses at the ready. Neighbors trickled in, some curious, some tense. The kind of atmosphere you get before a thunderstorm, when everyone knows something's about to snap, but no one knows which tree will split first. I didn't announce myself. I took a seat in the back row, binder on my lap. Velma began. This emergency session, she said, is being held to address escalating tensions, misinterpretations of board policy, and public disorder related to external modifications on several properties. Misinterpretations. Public disorder. I let the words sit, she continued, voice polished to a sheen. As we move forward, let it be clear that the board has always operated within its bylaws and legal rights. Any suggestion otherwise is unfounded and harmful to the integrity of our community. Then she glanced at me. It wasn't long, but it was direct, and it meant she knew. Across from her, Edric sat stiffly, his fingers laced in his lap, not touching the tablet on the table in front of him. When Velma asked for a roll call, he answered without looking up. When she asked for old business, he stayed silent. Then, right before she moved on to new items, he cleared his throat. I believe we've skipped something, Edric said. There's a concern that's been formally submitted to the county ADA office regarding our enforcement practices. Velma stiffened. That concern has not been presented to this board, she said too quickly. I believe it will be, Edric replied, within the next 72 hours. Murmurs broke out in the crowd. Velma raised her hand. Mr. Waylon, please refrain from speculative statements. I stood up. Then let's make it concrete. Eyes turned. Some widened, others narrowed. I walked to the front and placed the binder on the table, square in the center. Her assistants looked to her. She didn't touch it. This, I said, contains enough evidence for the city's compliance office to initiate a full audit of this HOA's treatment of accessibility structures. Velma laughed once, short, dry. You have no authority to dictate board policy, Sheriff. I met her gaze. I'm not here as sheriff. I'm here as Rowan's father, and this binder doesn't need authority to exist. It's documentation. And it's going to the Office of Fair Housing, the ADA Oversight Unit, and, if necessary, the press. Someone in the back clapped once before stopping, unsure if it was allowed. Velma leaned back. We've followed every legal procedure. The citations were lawful. Any narrative you're building? is backed by timestamps, signatures, and your own words, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I have your emails, Ms. Corbin, your recorded statements, your removal plans, and I have the footage of you laying hands on my son. That landed. The silence thickened. Edric finally looked up. I move that we table all further enforcement actions pending an independent audit. I second it, another board member said. A woman I didn't know by name. Velma stared at them both, frozen. And for the first time, I saw it. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. The vote passed, 4-3. And just like that, Velma's power cracked, not with a bang, but a motion. And I walked out without saying another word. The audit notice arrived 4 days later. Unlike the HOA's threats, it didn't come in colored envelopes or carry inflated language. Just a plain envelope from the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Inside was a single-page statement confirming receipt of complaint, acknowledgement of preliminary findings, and formal initiation of investigation into discriminatory enforcement patterns in Cypress Thorn Bluffs. The copy was also emailed to every board member. Velma didn't show her face for 2 days after that. No porch inspections, no compliance patrols, not even her usual morning circuit with her tablet clutched like a scepter. Word spread fast, and while some neighbors stayed quiet, others didn't. I started noticing small things, flags of quiet rebellion. The Harrisons repainted their accessibility rail bright yellow. A handmade sign appeared on the Richter family's porch. Accessibility is not an eyesore. Kids started using our ramp as part of their chalk drawings again, and not one parent stopped them. It was subtle, but it was movement. I didn't slow down. The next step was internal. I spent the next 2 days compiling a full compliance timeline, building on Carmen's records, cross-matching every violation with board meeting dates, Edric's emails, and citation images. I included photos of the flagged yards, the paint-marked curbs, and the utility survey flags. I added screenshots of the HOA portal, where documents were quietly modified after enforcement actions. It all formed a single, undeniable arc. Not just overreach, a pattern. And patterns, when documented, carry legal weight. The day after the audit notice dropped, Carmen called. "I've reviewed the materials," she said. "Your binder's airtight. The voice transcripts are damning. I forwarded the dashcam stills to the Regional ADA Council. They're assigning legal review. Timeline? Soon. We're fast-tracking it. And just so you're aware, I also received an anonymous tip this morning. Something about internal budget manipulation tied to enforcement penalties. That caught my attention. Velma's been using fine revenue to cover administrative expenses? Possibly. If true, that's financial misappropriation. It would expand the scope of the audit. Do you need names? Just one, if it's clean. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "You'll have it." Later that afternoon, I visited Edric again. This time, he didn't look surprised when I knocked. "I figured you'd come," he said, holding the door open. "They've gone quiet." "Too quiet," I said. "I need a name." He didn't even ask what for. "There's an HOA accountant," he said. "External contractor, not on the board. Her name's Talia Henwick. Velma worked with her before she took presidency. She's the only one with access to the expense logs and fine processing. She loyal? She's practical. She won't protect Velma if it burns her." I nodded. "Can you reach her?" "I'll try." That night, I received an email from a private address. No subject, no text. Just a PDF attachment titled 2024 Q2 HOA Expense Fund Allocation. PDF. I opened it. It showed that nearly 40% of collected fines over the past 6 months had been routed to a Community Standards Enforcement Fund, a category that covered everything from meeting catering to website redesigns, unauthorized by membership vote. That was a violation of fiduciary duty. The next morning, I added it to the package. By then, neighbors were talking, not just in passing, but in groups, in front yards, at the park. Quietly, yes, but with purpose. Edric said 3 board members had reached out to him privately. One of them, an alternate, was drafting a petition for special election. They weren't just waiting for the audit to crush Velma. They were preparing to remove her, themselves. At noon, I stood at the base of the ramp with a paint roller in my hand, Rowan sat nearby, watching. "You sure?" I asked. He nodded. We began with the base coat, clean white, to cover the old peeling colors. Then we sketched the outlines Lana had drawn years ago. He remembered each one: the swirl of Orion, the golden arc of Saturn's ring, the tiny scatter of stars that looked like freckles. It wasn't just repainting, it was reclaiming. Halfway through, I noticed 3 neighbors standing across the street watching. One of them, Mrs. Baines, walked over with a tray of cold drinks and a quiet smile. "Thought you two might be thirsty," she said, voice gentle. "I always liked the stars." That evening, I stepped inside, washed the paint off my hands, and checked the mail. A small envelope sat waiting. Inside was a single line typed on plain cardstock: "Special recall vote, 1 week." Velma's clock had started ticking. The community center hadn't been this full in years. Folding chairs scraped tile floors. People stood along the walls, murmuring in low tones. The air buzzed with the tension of something long denied, like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath for months and was finally exhaling. At the front of the room, Velma Corbin sat alone at the table where the HOA board usually lined up. Her assistants weren't with her today. No tablet, no clipboard. Just a manila folder clutched in both hands and the rigid posture of someone still trying to look like they hadn't already lost. I stayed near the back, arms crossed. I didn't wear my badge, not tonight. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was community reckoning. The HOA secretary, a younger woman named Mira Das, who'd stayed mostly silent during past meetings, stood behind the podium. She cleared her throat and raised her voice just enough to be heard without a mic. "This special session has been called per petition, signed by 71 homeowners. The motion under consideration is a vote of no confidence and immediate recall of current board president Velma Corbin." Velma stood before she was asked. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "This is retaliation," she said, voice sharp. "I've served this neighborhood for 9 years. I've preserved its character, protected its home values, and enforced the standards we all agreed to. What's happening now is a witch hunt built on emotion and misinformation." She scanned the room. Her gaze passed over me, then flinched away. "I've seen the materials being circulated. Emails taken out of context, audio manipulated, and I'll remind all of you, ADA regulations do not override the HOA's right to maintain architectural harmony." A murmur rose from the crowd, quick and ugly. Someone near the front stood up. "My son's prosthetic ramp was painted to match our house. You fined us anyway." Velma lifted her chin. "Because it lacked pre-approval." A second voice followed. "You told my husband his oxygen tank cart was a visual trip hazard. You called it clutter." "Procedure," Velma began, but Mira held up a hand. "That's enough." Velma turned, shocked. "This is my board?" "No," Mira said quietly. "It's the community's board, and they've asked for a vote." Velma sat slowly. Her knuckles were white against the folder. Mira continued. "Before we begin, the motioners have requested a statement from a community member." All eyes turned toward me. I didn't move at first. Then I stepped forward, slow and measured, binder under one arm. The room didn't fall silent. It held its breath. I set the binder on the table beside Mira and looked straight at Velma. "My name is Merrick Langston," I said. "Some of you know me as a neighbor. Some of you know me as the sheriff. But most of you probably know me now as the father of the boy she dragged off his own ramp." Velma flinched. The folder in her hands shook. "I've spent most of my life protecting people," I continued. "But until this year, I never thought I'd have to protect my son from the place we call home." I opened the binder. "These are not accusations. These are records, board emails, meeting transcripts, financial documents, audio files, all showing a deliberate, sustained effort to penalize residents with medical accommodations, all backed by timestamps and witnesses." I looked out at the room. This isn't just about me or my son. It's about the way this board has turned policy into punishment, the way it's treated dignity like it's a violation. I stepped back. Mira nodded once and opened the vote. It wasn't close. Out of 91 ballots, 83 voted for immediate removal. Velma didn't speak when the result was read. She stood, gathered her folder, and walked out without a word. No eye contact, no exit speech, just silence. The door closed behind her. and for the first time in nearly a year, it stayed closed. Edric walked over, his limp more pronounced than usual. He placed a small envelope on the table. "My resignation," he said. "Effective tomorrow." Mira looked surprised. "You helped make this right." "I enabled it long enough," he replied, voice low. Then he looked at me. "You finish this, all the way." I nodded once. We weren't done. Not yet. But now, we weren't alone. The ADA enforcement letter arrived on official letterhead, stamped and sealed, addressed not just to Velma Corbin, but to the entire Cypress Thorn Bluffs Homeowners Association. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a formal finding. 3 counts of discriminatory enforcement, 2 counts of retaliatory citation patterns, 1 confirmed act of physical endangerment against a minor with a federally protected disability. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen, fingers pressed into the counter's edge. It was cold language, legal, measured, precise, but every line hit like a verdict. Every sentence held the weight of what Rowan had lived through. I forwarded the scanned copy to Mira Das, now acting president of the board. I didn't hear back for a few hours. When I did, it was a single line. "Would you be willing to read it at the community meeting?" I didn't hesitate. The next Friday, we gathered at the park near the lake. Not the clubhouse, not anymore. That building still sat under review for misuse of funds. The doors were locked pending investigation. Neighbors set up folding chairs in the grass. Kids ran across the gravel path and under the picnic canopy. A few of them passed by the ramp on their scooters, waving at Rowan, who was posted on our porch with a walkie-talkie and a grin that hadn't appeared in months. Edric was there too, standing near the back, off to the side. He hadn't rejoined the board, but he showed up anyway. Quiet, present. I stepped onto the makeshift stage, just a picnic bench pushed beneath a banner that read, "Access belongs here." I unfolded the letter and took a breath. This letter is from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, I began. It is the result of a joint investigation with the ADA Compliance Unit regarding formal complaints filed against the Cypress Thorn Bluffs HOA. I read each paragraph with care. When I got to the part about documented and repeated use of fines and architectural codes to target medically necessary accommodations, a hush fell across the crowd. When I reached the statement that the enforcement actions pursued by HOA board leadership constituted a pattern of exclusionary governance, there were no more murmurs, just stillness. I finished the letter with the final mandate. The HOA must implement mandatory ADA compliance training for all current and future board members, cease enforcement of all disputed citations, and submit to 6 months of external compliance oversight. When I looked up, Mira stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "We've begun the process," she said. "The citations are being cleared, liens canceled. Any fines tied to disability access will be refunded or rescinded." She paused. "And we're not going back to the way things were." Applause started near the front. It wasn't thunderous, but it was steady, honest. I stepped down and walked back through the chairs. Edric caught my eye as I passed. He didn't say anything, just gave a short nod, then turned away, hands folded behind his back. Later that evening, Rowan and I sat on the porch. The ramp gleamed fresh with new paint. His stars stretched all the way down now, uninterrupted. We'd added more this time. Some were constellations we made up ourselves. He pointed to one in the corner. "That's Mom's," he said. I nodded. "And that one," I said, pointing to a swirl of 3 stars in a spiral, "is ours." He leaned against my arm and closed his eyes. "You think they'll try again?" he asked softly. "Someone might," I said. "But they won't win." The sky was clear. A few real stars had already started to appear, just over the roofline. One of the neighbor kids biked past and shouted a greeting. Rowan waved back, then turned to me. "Next time someone says my ramp is ugly, yeah, I'll say it's not a ramp, it's a launch pad." I smiled. "It is now." Inside, a fresh envelope waited on the counter. Not from the HOA, from the state ADA outreach coordinator. They wanted to use our footage and our story as part of a training series for neighborhood compliance officers. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I didn't want to, but because for the first time in months, everything felt still, felt right, and I wanted to hold on to that just a little longer. The morning after the community meeting, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and found Rowan already out there, bundled in a hoodie, studying the ramp like it was a chapter he'd finally finished reading. He traced a finger over the freshly painted star at the top, the one he said belonged to his mother. The sun hadn't risen fully yet, so the paint shimmered faintly in the pale blue dawn, almost glowing on its own. "You ready?" I asked. He nodded, gripping his wheels. "Yeah." He rolled forward on his own, smooth, confident, no hesitation this time. The chair glided down the ramp silently, the new coat of sealant catching the light as he descended toward the driveway. I followed a few steps behind, watching him, watching the ramp, feeling the weight of everything it had survived. Halfway down, Rowan stopped and looked back at me. "It feels different today," he said. "It is," I answered. "Today it's protected, not just by paint and wood, by law." He grinned, then continued to the base, where he turned in a small circle, testing the new wheel bearings I'd installed over the weekend. For the first time in a long time, he looked free. Not just mobile, free. Across the street, a small crowd had begun gathering on their lawns. The Harrisons, the Baines family, even Mrs. Richter stood with a travel mug in hand. They weren't there to stare. They were there because the HOA had posted an official notice last night, visible on every mailbox. ADA compliance mandated. All previous accessibility violations rescinded. President Corbyn removed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was the final line drawn in ink. I heard a car door shut behind me. When I turned, I saw Edric walking up the driveway, moving slower than usual, but upright, steady. He held something in his hand, a small wooden plaque, polished but old, the kind that stays with someone for decades. "This belonged to my mentor," he said as he reached me. "He gave it to me when I finished my accessibility thesis in '83. I kept it by my drafting table for years." He held it out. I read the engraving. "To build access is to build humanity. I think it belongs with you now," he said. I shook my head. "Edric, you don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." Behind him, Carmen approached from the sidewalk, holding a manila envelope. "Final findings," she said, and a formal apology letter from the regional ADA office for how long it took to start digging. She handed it to me, but I didn't open it yet. I didn't need paperwork to prove what we'd already lived through. By then, more neighbors had walked over, not nosy, not intrusive, just present. A half-dozen kids stood near Rowan, watching his wheels turn, asking questions about the ramp, not pitying him, admiring him. Rowan answered every question with the earnest confidence only kids have. He pointed to constellations he'd named himself, telling them which ones were supposed to be dragons, or shields, or galaxies bigger than our whole neighborhood. For the first time since the accident, he didn't hide his wheelchair. And for the first time since losing Lana, I didn't feel like the house was holding its breath. Mira arrived last, carrying a clipboard, the legitimate kind, not the weaponized version Velma used. "We're hosting a volunteer day next weekend," she said, "painting railings, installing access paths where needed, checking slope measurements. If you're willing, we'd like your guidance." I nodded. "Of course." "And Rowan's," she added, smiling at him. "He seems to have an eye for star patterns." Rowan gave her a proud nod, rolling a tiny arc on the driveway. As the crowd slowly broke apart, drifting back to their homes, Edric lingered. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You didn't just win," he said. "You shifted the ground under all of us. Sometimes one fight changes the culture of a place." "Sometimes," I said, "it just takes one person willing to speak when it matters." He looked down at his braces, then back at me. "Sometimes it takes two." A breeze moved through the neighborhood then, light and warm, brushing past the ramp's edges, rustling through the painted stars. It felt like a breath, one this place had been waiting to release. I walked over to Rowan, kneeling beside him. "You did good," I said. He shrugged. "I didn't do much." "You lived here," I said quietly, "and that was enough to change everything." He smiled, small but real, the kind that makes all the battles worth it. If you're still here with us at the end of this chapter, tell me one thing in the comments. How old are you?